I found the receipt before I found the messages, and I still remember how ordinary it looked sitting on the kitchen counter, folded once like it meant nothing, just a thin strip of paper from a hotel bar I'd never been to, dated for a Tuesday. He told me he was working late. And in that first 30 seconds I didn't cry or yell or even sit down. I just stood there holding it while the coffee maker hissed behind me and our dog scratched at the back door, because some part of me already knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a door cracking open on something I wasn't ready to see. My husband Mark had been careful for years, or maybe I just hadn't been looking, but that receipt broke the rhythm of our mornings in a way I couldn't unhear, and when he came downstairs tying his tie, he froze for half a second when he saw it in my hand, a pause so small it would have meant nothing to anyone else. "What's that?" he asked too quickly, already reaching for his phone. I said, "You tell me," and he laughed, a short sound, said it must have fallen out of his pocket at work, some client thing, and leaned in to kiss my cheek like always, but I stepped back and the space between us felt loud. We'd been married 8 years, no kids yet, both working, comfortable but not flashy, the kind of life where nothing dramatic ever happens and you start to think that's proof you're safe. He left for work like normal, telling me he loved me, and I watched his car pull out of the driveway with the same feeling I'd get when a storm was coming, but the sky still looked clear. I didn't follow him or call anyone. I went to my job and answered emails and nodded through meetings while that receipt burned a hole in my bag. And around noon I finally unfolded it all the way and saw the room charge attached at the bottom. Not a bar tab at all, just labeled vaguely enough to pass if you wanted it to. That afternoon I called the hotel pretending to be him, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, and asked for a copy for my records, and the woman on the phone didn't question it, just emailed it over, and there it was, his name typed clean in black, 1 night, 1 room, 2 guests. When I confronted him that night, I didn't raise my voice. I laid the paper on the table between us and said, "Tell me the truth right now." And he didn't deny it, not really. He sighed and rubbed his face and said it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that it had only happened once. And I noticed how he kept saying it instead of a name, how he wouldn't look at me when I asked who she was. We sat there until the food got cold, the house too quiet, and in that moment I realized the life I thought I was in had already shifted, that whatever came next would be about what I was willing to see and what I would do once I couldn't look away anymore. The next morning felt wrong in a quieter way, like the house itself was holding its breath, and as I drove to work I kept replaying the way he'd said, "once," the night before, calm and practiced, as if he'd already rehearsed that word. And by lunchtime I realized I wasn't actually hungry, I was waiting. Mark didn't text me all day, not even a "we'll talk later," which was its own kind of answer, and when I finally broke and called him, he let it ring twice before picking up and saying he was busy, that we'd talk at home, his voice flat like we were discussing a leaky sink. At work, my friend Jenna noticed I was off and asked if everything was okay, and I almost said yes out of habit. But instead I told her my husband had cheated on me, just like that, and the relief of saying it out loud surprised me more than her reaction, which was just a long exhale and a quiet, "I'm so sorry." She didn't ask for details or tell me what to do, she just let me talk while we sat in her car during break. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a few hours earlier this had been a secret that only existed in my head. That night at home, Mark cooked dinner like nothing had changed, chopping onions, asking about my day, and I let him, partly because I wanted to see how far he'd go pretending. After we ate, I told him I needed more than, "it was a mistake." And he finally said her name, Laura, someone from his office, married too, which he offered up like it made things better. He said it had started as talking, then lunches, then one night after a conference, all the usual details that somehow felt worse because of how ordinary they were. When I asked why, he shrugged and said he'd felt distant, that we'd been in a rut, words I recognized from articles I'd never thought applied to us. I asked if it was over and he said yes too quickly, swore he'd ended it weeks ago, promised transparency, access to his phone, anything I wanted, and I told him I needed time, which he nodded at like a reasonable request, like we were negotiating a schedule. That night I lay awake scrolling on my phone, reading other people's stories, not looking for advice so much as proof that I wasn't alone in this weird, suspended space where your life keeps moving but nothing feels real. And if you're listening to this and it feels familiar, if you've ever had a moment where something cracked open and you didn't know yet what would fall out, you can hit like or subscribe or even leave a comment if it helps to say it somewhere, because sometimes just knowing someone else is out there makes the quiet a little less heavy. Over the next few weeks, we settled into something that looked like normal if you didn't know where to look, and I learned quickly how much effort pretending takes, because every day brought some new detail I hadn't thought to ask about and now couldn't stop noticing. Mark handed me his phone without me asking, left it face up on the table, announced when he was running late, and each of those gestures felt both reassuring and insulting, like he was managing my suspicion instead of understanding it. I went back to the hotel on my lunch break one day just to see it, a beige building off the highway with a bar that smelled like citrus cleaner, and standing there I felt embarrassed by how average it was, how easily my marriage fit inside a place like that. A week later, I ran into Laura in the parking garage at Mark's office when I'd stopped by to drop off paperwork he'd forgotten, and I only knew it was her because Mark had shown me a photo on his phone, smiling stiffly like he was showing me a coworker, not the woman he'd slept with. She recognized me too, her eyes flicking to my hand checking for a ring, and she said my name like a question, then told me she was sorry, that it hadn't meant to go that far, that her marriage had been struggling, and I nodded because that's what you do when someone apologizes even if it lands wrong. We stood there between our cars, both of us blocking doors we didn't open, and she told me she'd cut off contact, that she and Mark barely spoke now, and I thanked her out of reflex, which haunted me later more than anything else. That night I told Mark I'd seen her and he got quiet, asked what she'd said, and when I told him he said, "See, it's done," like that settled it. But it wasn't done for me, not even close, because now there was a face attached to the lie, a voice I could hear saying my name, and it followed me into the small moments, like when Mark reached for me in bed and I tensed without meaning to, or when his phone buzzed and my stomach dropped even though I knew the password and could check. I started therapy on my own, sitting across from a woman who asked me what I wanted, not what I was afraid of losing, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had asked me that directly. Mark asked once if I thought we were going to be okay, and I said I didn't know, which felt more honest than anything else I'd said since this started. And as the days went on, that not knowing became its own kind of weight, heavy but stable, something I could carry while waiting to see what would finally tip it one way or the other. By the 4th month after the receipt, I realized the hardest part wasn't the anger, it was the constant low-grade vigilance. The way my body stayed slightly tense even on good days, like I was waiting for something else to drop. And that was when I started paying attention to patterns instead of promises. Mark was still doing everything right, therapy together once a week, check-ins at night, small apologies slipped into conversation, but there were gaps that didn't match the story he'd given me, little inconsistencies that were easy to ignore if he wanted peace more than truth. He said the affair ended weeks before I found out, but his calendar showed lunches that kept repeating long after that, labeled as team meetings, and when I asked he said they were group things, nothing personal, though he couldn't name who else was there without pausing. One evening his phone buzzed while he was in the shower and I didn't grab it right away, I just watched it light up on the nightstand, the screen lighting the wall, and when I finally looked, it was a message from a number without a name, just a single sentence that said, "Are you sure she's okay with this?" I didn't open it, didn't need to, and when he came out, towel around his waist, humming like it was any other night, I handed him the phone and asked who it was, and he said it was a guy from work, some joke taken out of context, and I let it drop because I was tired and didn't want another late-night interrogation. At couples therapy the next day he talked about rebuilding trust, about wanting to be better, and I watched the therapist nod and guide us through exercises that felt reasonable on the surface, and I wondered if I was being unfair for still feeling unsettled. After the session in the parking lot, Mark reached for my hand and said he felt hopeful, and I smiled because that's what you do when someone says something hopeful out loud, but on the drive home I kept thinking about that message, about the way he'd answered too smoothly. That weekend we went to a friend's birthday barbecue and I noticed how Mark hovered near his phone, how he angled it away when he checked it, habits he hadn't bothered hiding before because there'd been nothing to hide, and when I teased him about being addicted to work he laughed a little too loudly. Later that night after he fell asleep I sat on the edge of the bed listening to his breathing even out, and for the first time since this started I didn't feel sad or angry, I felt resolved in a quiet, unfamiliar way, like something inside me had shifted from waiting to watching. I didn't know yet what I was going to find or if I'd find anything at all, but I knew I was done accepting explanations that only made sense if I stopped asking questions, and that knowing settled into me with a weight that felt less like fear and more like preparation. The following Tuesday I left work early without telling Mark, something I hadn't done in years, and drove home with a calm that scared me more than panic ever had, because it felt deliberate, like I was finally acting instead of reacting. His car wasn't in the driveway yet, which I'd expected, and the house was quiet in that flat afternoon way that makes every sound sharper, and I went straight to his home office, not snooping wildly like people imagine, but opening the one drawer he always kept locked, the one he'd joked about holding nothing but old tax documents. The key was taped to the back of the filing cabinet, right where he'd always hidden it, trusting habit more than secrecy, and inside the drawer was a second phone, powered off, plain black case, no cracks, no dust, like it was still in regular use. My hands didn't shake when I turned it on, and I didn't rush. I sat in his chair and waited for it to boot up, noticing how familiar it felt to be in that space, surrounded by our shared life while holding proof that part of it had been split off. There were dozens of messages, not just from Laura but from other numbers too, some saved, some not, spanning months after he'd sworn everything was over. And the tone wasn't flirtatious so much as logistical, planning lunches, hotels, excuses, the language of people managing time instead of feelings. One thread stood out, newer, where Laura asked if I knew yet, if I was still believing him, and his response was a single word: yes. I didn't cry then either, I just felt something click into place, like the last piece of a picture I'd been trying not to finish. When Mark came home later and found me sitting at the kitchen table with both phones lined up in front of me, his and the other one, he stopped short like he'd hit a wall, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching until he said my name in a way that sounded almost respectful. I asked him how long he planned on letting me live inside a lie he was actively maintaining, and he sat down heavily, put his head in his hands and said he hadn't known how to stop, that it had gotten bigger than him, that he was afraid of losing everything, and I told him he already had, he'd just been the last one to notice. The conversation didn't explode the way movies make you expect. There was no shouting, just facts laid out on the table like items in an inventory, dates, messages, names, and every answer he gave confirmed what I already knew, that the affair hadn't ended, it had just gone underground, organized enough to survive discovery. By the time we went to bed that night, I'd asked him to sleep in the guest room, and he did without arguing, carrying a pillow and blanket down the hall like someone moving into temporary housing. And as I lay there alone, staring at the ceiling, I understood that whatever decision came next would be irreversible, not because of anger or pride, but because the truth, once fully seen, has a way of closing doors you can't pretend are still open. The days after that confrontation moved slowly but decisively, like paperwork after an accident, and Mark didn't try to fix things anymore, which was how I knew we'd crossed a line neither of us could step back over. He told his office he needed time off, slept in the guest room without being asked again, and answered my questions honestly for the first time, not because he wanted redemption but because the performance was over and there was nothing left to manage. I called a lawyer on Thursday afternoon from my car, hands steady on the wheel, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. And when I told Mark that evening, he nodded and said he understood, a word that landed flat because understanding hadn't stopped him before. We told our parents separately, short conversations full of pauses and careful language, and I was surprised by how quickly the story became something other people carried too, how it stopped being just mine to hold. My mother cried, his father went quiet, and no one asked me to reconsider, which felt like a small mercy. At work I told my manager I needed flexibility for personal reasons, and she didn't pry, just said to take care of myself, and I realized how much of life keeps going even when yours is actively breaking apart. Mark and I tried one last therapy session, not to reconcile but to untangle logistics, and the therapist shifted easily into that role, talking about boundaries and communication during separation, and it was strange how ordinary it sounded, like we were discussing a remodel instead of a marriage ending. At home we divided things slowly, deliberately, making lists of what belonged to who, and I noticed Mark avoided anything sentimental, like he couldn't afford to look too closely at the version of us he'd already dismantled. One night he asked if I hated him and I said no, not because I was being kind but because it was true. What I felt was clearer than that, a firm recognition that I could not stay married to someone who could look me in the eye and say yes to a lie like that. He moved out at the end of the month into a short-term rental across town, packing his clothes and leaving the books and furniture behind, and when he closed the door for the last time, there was no dramatic final exchange, just a quiet click that echoed longer than I expected. I sat on the couch afterward and let the stillness settle, noticing how the house felt larger without him, not emptier exactly, just less crowded with explanations, and for the first time since this began, I slept through the night without waking up to check a phone that was no longer my problem to monitor. Living alone again was an adjustment I hadn't planned for, and the first few weeks felt like I was borrowing someone else's life, making dinner for one, choosing what to watch without compromise, sleeping diagonally across the bed out of habit more than comfort. The legal process moved forward in predictable steps, filings, disclosures, meetings that felt oddly administrative given how personal everything was, and I learned to answer questions about assets and timelines without attaching feelings to them, like I was narrating a stranger's history. Mark and I communicated mostly through email now, brief and practical, coordinating the sale of the house and dividing joint accounts. And I noticed how much easier it was to be calm when I wasn't bracing for an emotional turn in every conversation. One afternoon, I ran into Laura at the grocery store, an encounter I'd imagined in sharper terms than it actually happened, and we stood there between the produce and the freezer section, both of us clearly wishing we were somewhere else. She told me she and her husband were separating too, said she was in therapy, that she regretted everything, and I believed her in the way you believe someone who's dealing with consequences, not absolution. I told her I hoped she figured out what she needed, not for her sake but for the sake of not repeating this with someone else. And then we walked away in opposite directions, the interaction brief and strangely neutral. Back at work, I took on a new project that required travel, something I'd avoided before because Mark's schedule had always taken priority, and being on the road in unfamiliar cities reminded me that my life extended beyond the radius of my marriage. Friends checked in, invited me out, listened when I talked and let it drop when I didn't, and I realized how much support had been there all along, waiting for me to stop pretending everything was fine. Some nights were still hard, especially when paperwork arrived in the mail or when I caught myself reaching for my phone to tell Mark something small, like a joke or a piece of news, and those moments stung in a dull, echoing way. But the intensity was different now, less volatile, more like a steady ache that I could live alongside. And as the weeks passed, I began to trust that the worst of it was behind me, not because I was healed but because I wasn't lying to myself anymore about the life I was actually living. By the time the house went on the market, the shock of everything had worn down into routine, and I found myself making decisions with a steadiness I didn't recognize as my own at first, choosing paint touch-ups, scheduling showings, answering questions from the realtor without flinching when she said, "You and your husband out of habit." Mark and I did a final walkthrough together, moving through rooms like co-workers closing out a project, and when we reached the office where I'd found the second phone, he paused and said he was sorry again, not dramatically, just flatly, and I nodded because acknowledging it felt easier than revisiting it. The sale went through faster than expected, the market in our area still competitive, and signing those papers felt more final than any emotional conversation we'd had, my name standing alone where it used to be paired with his. I moved into a smaller apartment closer to work, unpacking slowly, deciding what deserved space and what didn't. And I noticed how little I missed the things I'd thought were essential before, how quickly my sense of need recalibrated. One evening, Mark emailed asking if we could talk in person, said he wanted closure, and I agreed to meet him for coffee, not out of obligation but curiosity, wanting to see who he was now that the crisis phase was over. He looked tired but lighter somehow, told me he was living alone for the first time since college, that he was in individual therapy, that he was trying to understand why he'd compartmentalized his life so thoroughly. And I listened without interrupting, not because I owed him that space, but because I was done carrying unfinished conversations. When he asked if I thought there was any chance we could find our way back someday, the question hung between us, familiar but outdated, and I told him no, not angrily, just clearly, explaining that trust wasn't something I was willing to rebuild from scratch with the same person who'd dismantled it twice. He nodded, accepted it more easily than I'd expected, and we parted without promises to stay friends or keep in touch. Just a mutual understanding that this chapter was closed. Walking back to my car, I felt a quiet relief, not triumphant or dramatic, just the kind that comes when you stop negotiating with reality and let it be what it is. The months after that settled into something almost peaceful, not because everything was fine, but because it was honest, and there's a difference you don't appreciate until you've lived without it. The divorce finalized without drama. A judge signing off on documents that reduced 8 years to a handful of legal conclusions, and I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I expected, like I'd been holding a breath I didn't realize I was still holding. I started saying "my ex-husband" out loud and noticed how quickly the words lost their charge, how they became descriptive instead of loaded. At work, the travel project turned into a promotion, more responsibility, more trust, and I took it without guilt this time, without checking how it would affect anyone else's schedule. I dated casually, cautiously, learning how to ask better questions early, how to listen to my own discomfort instead of explaining it away, and when something felt off I walked away without needing proof. One night, while cleaning out an old email account, I came across messages from Mark from the early years of our marriage, small affectionate notes, reminders to pick up groceries, jokes that had once made me laugh, and instead of spiraling I closed the tab and deleted the account, not because those memories were false, but because they belonged to a version of my life that no longer needed my attention. Occasionally, mutual friends mentioned Mark in passing, updates about his job or where he'd moved, and I felt a distant curiosity, The kind you have about someone you once knew well but no longer track closely. The biggest change, though, was internal and subtle, the way I no longer scanned rooms for exits or checked phones for explanations, the way my nervous system slowly learned it was safe to relax. Trust, I realized, wasn't something I needed to rush back into with another person, it was something I was rebuilding with myself, through consistent choices that didn't require justification. Some evenings were still quiet in a way that pressed on me, but the quiet no longer felt like punishment, it felt like space, and space, I learned, can be generous if you let it. I'm telling this now from a place that feels settled, not healed in a dramatic way, just aligned, like my life and my values are finally facing the same direction again, and that alignment has been the real resolution. I live in the same city but a different rhythm, mornings shaped by my own plans, evenings that aren't spent decoding someone else's behavior, and the absence of that constant low-level doubt has changed me more than the divorce ever did. When people ask if I'd do anything differently, I don't give a clean answer because the truth is I learned to trust myself by watching what happened when I ignored my instincts for too long, and that lesson stuck in a way advice never could. Mark and I haven't spoken in a long time, not out of bitterness, just because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said in action, and that feels like the right kind of ending, quiet and complete. Sometimes I think about that first receipt on the counter and how small it was compared to everything it unraveled, and I don't feel panic anymore. Just a steady respect for the version of me who didn't look away even when it would have been easier. What surprises me most now is how normal my days feel, how stability stopped being about control and started being about consistency, about knowing that what I see is what's actually there. I don't replay conversations anymore or rewrite moments in my head, and when something feels off in my life, I address it early instead of storing it away and calling it patience. If you're listening to this and you recognize parts of your own life in it, if you've ever had that moment where something doesn't add up and you feel yourself explaining it away, I hope you pause and listen to that discomfort instead of arguing with it, because clarity doesn't usually arrive loudly, it shows up as persistence, as the same thought returning until you finally stop pushing it aside. You don't need proof to justify protecting your peace, and you don't need permission to choose a life that doesn't require constant vigilance or emotional accounting. If this story stayed with you, if it helped you feel a little less alone or gave you language for something you've been carrying quietly, you can like the video, subscribe, or leave a comment, not for numbers, but because recognition shared out loud has a way of loosening shame and reminding people they're not imagining things. I didn't come out of this stronger in the way people like to frame these things. I came out clearer, more attentive to myself, more willing to walk away from what erodes me slowly. That clarity has been enough to build a life that feels solid, not because it's perfect or free of risk, but because it's honest and because I no longer confuse endurance with love, and that, for me, is where it truly ends.